Hello everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Star Trek Beyond, directed by Justin Lin. And as the third installment in the Star Trek reboot, this film dares to boldly go exactly where you thought it would go. Justin Lin is mostly known for directing several of the Fast and Furious films, which obviously is quite a departure from J.J. Abrams, who directed the first two films, his more lens flare-ridden Spielbergian style. This film has a pace that just feels quicker, and it has even more of an action feel to it, even compared to the last two films. The plot of this particular installment is that the Enterprise is taking part in a rescue mission that turns out to be a trap. The Enterprise is ambushed, and the crew ends up crash landing on a mysterious unknown planet. And they're all spread out from each other, and they're basically just trying to reunite and go back home. If I'm going into this film not as a big Star Trek fan, not knowing much about the series, and you just want to go in having a good time without becoming really cerebrally engaged, then you'll have a fine time. It's a very typical summer blockbuster movie that has a very efficient, fluid feel to it, and it's, structured pretty well, I'd say, to a certain point. The action in this film is very solid. I don't personally feel like it's particularly memorable. Nothing really stands out to me as absolutely breathtaking, but it does its job. The sequence in the first act of the film where the Enterprise is crashing is very reminiscent of the sequence where the Enterprise is also crash landing in Star Trek Generations back in the early 90s, which I thought was a great sequence, and I think that this one complemented that very well. If I want to talk more morals, ethics, I think this movie does mirror the time in which we live in, a time that is becoming increasingly more cynical and teetering on the edge of utter destruction. And the Enterprise carries that same feeling of dread, of losing so much and barely holding on to that hope, but of course they have to, because that is the message of Star Trek. One thing that I always appreciated about Star Trek was its positive message about bringing people together, having a positive view of the future, which you don't see very often. They're usually dystopian futures. But Star Trek was about unity and peace, and no matter what race, or in this case species, you are, it didn't matter. It is at least a well-intentioned message, and it's one of the few themes in this film that I think actually honors the original Gene Roddenberry vision. I like Sofia Boutella in the film. She becomes an ally quite early on in the movie, and she gives the film kind of a sense of freshness, vim and vigor, if you will, which I think that the franchise can always use. And if it weren't for characters like her, and if it weren't for the banter and the occasional intermingling between the main ensemble cast of the Enterprise, I don't think I would like this movie very much. But thankfully, you do have a few scenes in there that give the movie its much-needed pathos. Kirk and Spock are both going through a similar existential crisis, wondering, what does life mean? What am I doing? Is all of this really worth it? I particularly like the scenes between Bones and Spock, and I know that the stoicism of Spock being a Vulcan has become, I guess, more schlocky than it was in the original series, and also I think it's kind of become the butt of the joke. At least it gives the actors something to chew on in the midst of all this carnage and all this action. And Carl Urban, who plays Dr. McCoy, is just fantastic. He really gets it. He honors DeForest Kelley's original performance while offering something new and not becoming a straight caricature, not becoming an imitation of what he was. But my problem with the movie here is that these little scenes that you see, there's not enough of them, not nearly enough. The film is so heavily dependent on the action and less on the character. It's almost like 80% action, 20% character development. And if the film was supposed to be more of kind of like a Star Wars-y sci-fi action adventure swashbuckler, then I think it would make more sense, but this is Star Trek. Star Trek to me is about ideas and less about spectacle. And that's part of why I think you don't really have that many great Star Trek movies. It works so much better as a series because you can kind of compartmentalize these small adventures, and they're very episodic, they're vignettes. And also we live in an age that you're appealing to a demographic in terms of blockbuster movies that have very short attention spans, and they're not interested in thoughtful pieces. So I understand that. I understand that you have to appeal to a certain audience. I just wish that maybe they could do at least something a little bit bold. I wish that they were able to at least infuse the action with something digestible for our intellect. But this movie definitely is not interested in progressing, not moving the franchise forward. It's just kind of stuck on this one level, not offering much that's exciting or different. It's just kind of recycling themes that we've seen in the last couple Star Trek movies, and I would argue even a lot of the Next Generation movies as well. For instance, you've got the villain here, Krall, played by Idris Elba, who has the potential to be a really interesting villain. He's got an interesting backstory, but the film goes into it, I think, far too late, and not enough to give us that emotional investment. He could have been really complex, and we could have had the chance to really see the lines blur between good and evil, but you don't. He's just kind of that symbol of dread and a threat to the forces of good. You could almost replace this character with Nero, the Eric Bana villain in the 2009 Star Trek movie, and you almost wouldn't be able to tell much of a difference. And I don't think that's a good sign, because the villain is such an important part of the story. And I don't think this movie is as good, certainly not as good as the 2009 Star Trek, and I don't think it's as good as Into Darkness either. Those films certainly were not perfect, but at least there was more for the ensemble of actors to do in terms of character. And this film is not a bad film. You know, the pieces are there and the foundation is set, obviously, but it's entertaining to a certain extent. It just lacks that special something. If you're a fan of Star Trek, like the original series, Next Generation, you know, like I am, then, and you want something that's more comparable to that, this is not going to work for you. But if you can kind of set aside your bias and your Star Trek purist mindset, and you just go in, turn your brain off, and have a good time at the movies for a couple hours, it's harmless. And that's my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below, and you can also like my Facebook page and the link below that. Catch you next time.